Please marry me.
Will you marry me?
Billionaire single man begs a homeless girl, but what she asked in return shocked everyone. A greatest ever love story for my loving family, with a beautiful surprise in Chapter 9. Hi, my beautiful, great and best family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. May the Almighty bless every woman with unshakable strength, radiant health, and everlasting peace. May He comfort the mothers whose hearts carry endless sacrifices, uplift the sisters who guide with wisdom, protect the wives who pour their souls into love, and honor the daughters who fill our homes with light and laughter. May no woman in this family ever feel small, for she is a queen created by God, a miracle walking among us and the heartbeat of every home. If your heart is true, right, present. If your love is real, right, I am with Mr. Peter. Gary Bellamy owned everything money could buy, yet he felt like the poorest man alive, trapped in a cage made of gold and lined with emptiness that echoed through his soul. The city sprawled beneath him like a glittering circuit board, each light representing lives he would never touch, dreams he would never understand. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, Gary Bellamy surveyed his empire, tech companies spanning 3 continents, real estate holdings that could house small nations, investments that grew faster than he could count them. Yet standing there in his $1,000 suit, surrounded by art worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, he felt absolutely nothing. The silence in his penthouse was deafening. No laughter echoed through these marble halls. No genuine conversation warmed these perfectly climate-controlled rooms. Every relationship in his life was transactional. Board members who smiled while calculating their next move. Women who saw dollar signs instead of the man behind them. Friends whose loyalty lasted exactly as long as their business dealings remained profitable. His phone buzzed against the glass table. Another message from his mother, the iron-willed matriarch of the Bellamy dynasty. The Campbell girl would make a perfect wife. Gary, excellent breeding, proper education. Her father's pharmaceutical empire would complement our tech holdings beautifully. The words made his stomach churn with revulsion. He wasn't looking for a business merger disguised as marriage. The family pressure had become suffocating, crushing him beneath expectations that grew heavier with each passing day. Board meetings now included subtle threats about his bachelor lifestyle, damaging investor confidence. His Uncle James had been particularly venomous during the last quarterly review, his words dripping with disdain. Investors want stability. Gary, they want to see a man who can commit, who can build something lasting beyond quarterly profits. Your reputation is becoming a liability that threatens everything we've built. Yet something nagged at Gary about the inheritance conditions his grandfather had established. The old man had been many things, brilliant, eccentric, surprisingly romantic for a business titan, but never arbitrary. Every decision had layers, purposes that often revealed themselves years later. Why 35? Why marriage specifically? His grandfather had once said, "The heart knows what the mind refuses to acknowledge." Gary, sometimes you have to create the right circumstances for truth to emerge. At the time, Gary had assumed he was talking about market opportunities. Gary set down his crystal tumbler of aged whiskey and laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp in the pristine space. A liability, that's what his life had become. One giant actuarial table where love was just another asset to be managed and optimized. He had built an empire by taking calculated risks, by seeing opportunities others missed, by being ruthless when necessary. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how to be human, forgotten how to feel anything beyond the cold satisfaction of another successful acquisition. The transformation had been so gradual he hadn't noticed it happening, like watching his hair grow or his face age. Changes too subtle to perceive day by day, but devastating in their cumulative effect. He had become a machine optimized for profit generation, a perfectly calibrated instrument that had lost the ability to play music, only capable of calculating its own efficiency. The irony struck him like lightning against steel. He could buy anything, go anywhere, have anyone he wanted, yet he felt more isolated than astronauts orbiting in the cold vacuum of space. At least they chose their solitude and knew when they would return to Earth. Gary's isolation was self-constructed, wrapped in silk and locked from the inside, with expectations that multiplied like compound interest, each achievement only raising the stakes for the next. His reflections stared back from the window, a man in his prime, successful beyond measure, handsome by any standard, and utterly devastatingly hollow. When was the last time he had felt genuine emotion? When had he last made a decision based on what his heart wanted, rather than what the market demanded? When had he last felt truly alive, instead of merely existing in this sterile paradise he had created? The memories of genuine feeling had become so distant, they felt like stories someone else had told him. He remembered being 8 years old, crying over a dead bird he'd found in the garden, his tears flowing freely until his father's stern voice cut through his grief. "Bellamy's don't cry over things that don't matter. Gary, save your emotions for things that affect the bottom line." That moment had been the beginning of his emotional death, the first brick laid in walls that now felt insurmountable. Even his relationships with women had become mechanical transactions. He could predict their responses with algorithmic accuracy, the way their eyes would light up when they learned his net worth, how quickly their affection would cool if he showed any real vulnerability. He had stopped hoping for genuine connection years ago, accepting that his wealth made authentic love impossible. People saw his bank account first, his loneliness never. Sleep had become his enemy, each night bringing the same restless tossing, the same questions without answers that circled his mind like vultures. His king-size bed felt like a wasteland, the silk sheets cold despite their thread count, despite the perfect temperature controls that regulated everything except the ice in his chest. The sleeping pills his doctor had prescribed only made the emptiness more vivid, turning his dreams into boardroom meetings where he negotiated contracts for emotions he couldn't feel. He would wake from these pharmaceutical-induced nightmares feeling more exhausted than when he had closed his eyes, haunted by visions of spreadsheets that calculated the cost of happiness in quarterly projections. Tonight was no different, but somehow worse. The clock showed 3 in the morning, its red digits glowing like angry eyes in the darkness. His mind raced like a stock ticker, processing deals, analyzing market trends, calculating profit margins with mechanical precision. He couldn't remember the last time his brain had simply been quiet, present in a moment without agenda or strategy, without the constant pressure to optimize and maximize every second of his existence. The silence in his penthouse felt different at this hour. Not peaceful, but oppressive, like the quiet before a storm that never came. Even the city sounds 47 floors below couldn't penetrate the perfect soundproofing that protected him from everything, including the very life he was supposedly living above. Making an impulsive decision that would have horrified his security team, Gary grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. The leather felt foreign against his skin. When had he last worn something that wasn't tailored specifically for him? He needed to walk, to breathe air that wasn't filtered through million-dollar systems, to see the world beyond his bulletproof glass barriers that protected him from everything, including authentic human experience. The elevator descended through his building's 47 floors, each number counting down like a timer towards something he couldn't name but desperately needed. When the doors opened to the street level, he dismissed his night security detail with a wave that brooked no argument. Their protests fell on deaf ears. For once, he wanted to be just another man walking city streets, not a target requiring protection from the very world he claimed to serve. The cool air hit his face like a revelation, sharp and honest in a way his climate-controlled environment never could be. When had he last felt wind that wasn't manufactured by machines? When had he last walked without a destination predetermined by calendar appointments and business objectives? The city at this hour revealed its true face, not the polished veneer of daylight commerce, but something rawer, more honest, more real than anything his boardroom had ever shown him. His expensive, Italian leather shoes clicked against cracked sidewalks as he wandered deeper into neighborhoods, his GPS apps colored red with warnings about crime statistics and property values. Here, life happened without quarterly projections or risk assessments. Here people struggled and survived with resources that wouldn't cover his monthly wine budget. Yet somehow they seemed more alive than anyone in his sanitized world. The contrast struck him like a physical blow, each step taking him further from his protected existence and deeper into something he had forgotten existed. While he worried about which private jet to take to his next vacation home, families in these apartments wondered how to make rent. While he complained about the emptiness of his gilded existence, people here fought for basics he took for granted. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was something else, a strange sense of authenticity he hadn't felt in years. As he walked deeper into the urban maze, something stopped him mid-stride. A sound floated through the darkness, pure and haunting, a woman's voice singing softly, each note carrying pain and beauty in equal measure. The melody was wordless, but it spoke to something deep in his chest that had been silent for too long. Something he had thought was dead, but was merely sleeping, waiting for the right key to awaken it. Gary found himself drawn toward the sound like a moth to flame, his feet carrying him around corners and down alleys without conscious direction. The voice grew stronger, more distinct, filled with a warmth his penthouse had never known. It was the sound of someone who understood suffering, but refused to let it steal their capacity for beauty. Someone who had been broken, but had chosen to sing rather than surrender to silence. Following the voice around the corner, Gary froze at what he saw, and in that moment, he realized his billion-dollar empire meant absolutely nothing. Chapter 2. The refusal that changed everything. Tamia Cherelle had learned long ago that dignity costs nothing, but it's worth everything, and she wore hers like armor forged in fire and tempered by storms that would have destroyed weaker souls. The scene before, Gary defied everything his world had taught him about value and worth, shattering his assumptions like glass against stone. In the doorway of an abandoned storefront, a black woman sat cradling a small child, her voice weaving magic into the cold night air. Her clothes were worn thin from washing and weather, held together by determination rather than fashion. Her shoes, bearing the scars of countless miles, walked with purpose. Yet she carried herself with a grace that put his society gatherings to shame, a dignity that no amount of money could purchase or poverty could steal. The child's face was pressed against her shoulder, small fingers clutched in the fabric of her coat, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had proven unreliable. She wasn't singing for an audience or hoping for coins. This was pure maternal instinct, the ancient act of using voice to transform fear into comfort, loneliness into connection. The melody seemed to wrap around them both like an invisible blanket, creating a pocket of warmth and safety in the harsh geometry of the urban night. This was Tamia Cherelle, though Gary didn't know her name yet. What he knew was that her presence commanded attention without demanding it, that her strength was evident in every line of her posture despite circumstances that should have broken her completely. She wasn't performing for coins or pity. She was simply being human in its purest form, offering comfort to a hungry child through the only currency she possessed, her voice, her presence, her unshakable humanity. The child in her arms couldn't have been more than 4, thin and fragile but peaceful in Tamia's embrace. As she sang, her fingers smoothed his hair with maternal tenderness that made Gary's chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. Here was love in its most essential form, not dependent on bank accounts or social status, not calculated for maximum return on investment. but flowing freely from a heart that refused to close, despite every reason it should have sealed itself against the world's cruelties. Gary stepped closer, his expensive shoes silent against the cracked pavement that told stories his pristine floors never could. Up close, he could see the intelligence in Tamia's eyes, sharp and assessing, the way she evaluated him without judgment, but with complete awareness. She wasn't naive about the world's cruelties. Her gaze held knowledge that spoke of battles fought and survived, of victories carved from defeat through sheer force of will. "That's beautiful," Gary said softly, not wanting to shatter the moment, but needing to acknowledge what he was witnessing, something real in a life that had become artificial in every way that mattered. Tamia looked up at him, and for a moment, time suspended itself between them like a held breath. Her eyes held depths that his therapist's office walls could never contain, stories that made his privileged angst feel both trivial and painfully real simultaneously. She didn't speak immediately, studying this well-dressed stranger who had wandered into her world like a lost tourist searching for something he couldn't name. "Music doesn't cost anything to make," she replied, her voice carrying the same warmth as her singing, rich with texture that spoke of joy and sorrow dancing together in perfect harmony. "But it can feed the soul when the body goes hungry, can warm the heart when the world grows cold." Gary reached into his wallet, pulling out bills that represented more money than many people saw in months, perhaps years. The gesture felt automatic, the same response he gave to every problem: throw money at it until it disappeared or transformed into something more manageable. "Please, let me help. Take this." The transformation in Tamia's posture was immediate and unmistakable, like watching a flower close its petals against an approaching storm. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted with pride that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, and her eyes flashed with something that made Gary take an involuntary step backward. This wasn't anger, it was dignity asserting itself against assumption, strength refusing to be diminished by circumstance. "I'm not for sale," Tamia said, each word delivered with quiet power that cut through Gary's soul like surgical steel, precise and devastating. "Not my voice, not my story, not my struggles, not my dignity. I didn't ask you for money, and I don't need your pity masquerading as charity." The rejection hit Gary harder than any business failure ever had, striking him in places he had forgotten existed. In his world, money solved everything with mechanical precision. Need something? Buy it. Want someone's attention? Pay for it. Facing a problem? Throw cash at it until it disappeared into the comfortable darkness of solved issues. But here stood a woman who looked at his offering with the same disdain he might show to someone trying to sell him fool's gold or empty promises. "I didn't mean to offend," Gary stammered, suddenly feeling like the child in this interaction, his usual confidence crumbling in the face of her unwavering strength. "I just thought—" "You thought what? That because I'm sitting on a sidewalk, I must be desperate enough to take charity from a stranger?" Tamia's voice remained level, controlled, but each word carried the weight of countless similar encounters. "That because my shoes have holes, my pride must have them too? That poverty automatically equals surrender?" Gary stared at her, recognition dawning slowly like sunrise over mountains he had never bothered to climb. This woman possessed something his money couldn't buy, couldn't rent, couldn't lease or acquire through hostile takeover or strategic investment. She had integrity that remained unshakable despite circumstances that would have crushed spirits far stronger than most. In rejecting his money, she had done something no one had done in years. She had surprised him completely, shown him a strength he had forgotten existed. The revelation struck him like lightning, illuminating a landscape he had never seen before. Here was power in its purest form, not the artificial strength that came from accumulating resources or wielding influence over others, but the genuine force that emerged when someone refused to compromise their soul regardless of the cost. He had spent his entire life among people who would sell their principles for the right price, who viewed integrity as a luxury they couldn't afford when faced with real temptation. But Tamia had faced the ultimate temptation, escape from poverty, security, comfort, and had turned it away because accepting it would have required her to become someone she couldn't respect. The magnitude of that choice was staggering to someone who had watched business partners abandon their ethics for far smaller rewards. "I've never met anyone who would refuse money on principle," Gary admitted, his voice carrying wonder that felt foreign on his tongue. "In my world, everything has a price. Everyone can be bought if you find the right currency. Money, status, power, security. But you're showing me that some things are genuinely priceless." The businessman in him wanted to analyze her motivations, to find the angle or strategy behind her refusal. But the man he was becoming under her influence recognized truth when he witnessed it, understood that he was seeing something rare and precious that couldn't be reduced to market calculations. "You're right," he admitted, and the words felt strange on his tongue. Unfamiliar as a foreign language, he was just beginning to learn. When was the last time he had admitted to being wrong about anything? When had anyone possessed the courage to correct him without agenda or fear of consequence? Something in Tamia's expression shifted slightly, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds that had dominated the sky for too long. She had expected defensiveness, argument, perhaps anger at being refused, the typical response of privileged people unused to hearing the word no. Instead, this stranger had offered something rarer than money, more valuable than gold, a genuine apology delivered without conditions or expectations. "Most people don't apologize when their charity gets rejected," she observed, adjusting the sleeping child in her arms with practiced ease that spoke of responsibilities shouldered without complaint. "Most people don't have the strength to reject it in the first place," Gary replied, and he meant every word with intensity that surprised them both. "Your refusal, it's not weakness disguised as pride. It's genuine power, the kind that can't be bought or borrowed or stolen." For the first time, Tamia almost smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that made Gary's chest tighten with unfamiliar warmth. "Strength isn't something you buy in stores or inherit from family names, Mr. Gary Bellamy." If his name meant anything to her, she didn't show it, and somehow that anonymity felt more liberating than any recognition he had ever received. In her world, apparently, billionaires were just another type of stranger wandering through the night, no more or less significant than anyone else seeking something real in darkness. "Well, Gary Bellamy, strength is something you earn through surviving what should have killed you but didn't." Tamia's voice carried wisdom that MBA programs couldn't teach, depth that came from living rather than learning. "It's getting up every morning when the world tells you to stay down, finding reasons to sing when silence would be easier." Something shifted in Gary's chest, like tectonic plates moving after years of stillness. Here was a woman who understood battles he had never fought, but somehow her words spoke to wars he had been fighting his entire life. Different enemies, different weapons, but the same fundamental struggle between who the world expected him to be and who he really was beneath the armor of success. The words that came next surprised him as much as they shocked her, emerging from depths he hadn't known still existed. "Please marry me." The statement hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross, impossible and inevitable simultaneously. Gary's own eyes widened as he realized what he had just said. The impulse born from something deeper than conscious thought, truer than any decision his rational mind had ever made. The laughter that escaped Tamia's lips wasn't joy. It was the sound of a woman who had heard every cruel joke the world could tell. And Gary realized he might have just delivered the cruelest one yet. Chapter 3. The condition that sealed their fate. Tamia had survived by trusting no one. But something in Gary's eyes made her consider the impossible, that sincerity could exist even in the most unlikely places, even in proposals that defied logic. The laughter died in Tamia's throat as she studied Gary's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read truth in shadows, searching for signs of mockery or malice. She had developed a finely tuned radar for cruelty over the years, an internal warning system that had kept her alive through situations that should have destroyed her completely. But Gary's expression held no trace of jest or superiority, only a raw vulnerability that seemed as surprised by his words as she was, as if they had emerged from places even he didn't know existed. "You're serious," she said, and it wasn't a question. The disbelief in her voice mixed with something Gary couldn't identify, not hope exactly, but a recognition of something genuine in an interaction that should have been anything but, something that cut through the darkness like unexpected dawn. "I am," Gary confirmed, though he was still processing the truth of it himself, still marveling at words that had emerged without calculation or strategy. "I know how it sounds. I know how insane this is, how impossible it seems. But standing here, watching you refuse money because it would compromise who you are. I've never met anyone with that kind of strength, that kind of unshakable integrity." Tamia shifted the sleeping child to her other arm, her movements careful and deliberate, each gesture carrying the efficiency born from circumstances where wasted motion could mean wasted energy she couldn't afford to lose. Gary found himself fascinated by her grace under pressure, the way she maintained dignity in conditions specifically designed to strip it away. "Like a flower blooming in concrete. You don't know anything about me," Tamia said. But her voice lacked the sharp edge it had carried when she refused his money. Instead, there was something almost curious in her tone, as if she was examining this strange moment from multiple angles. "You see a homeless woman singing to a hungry child, and suddenly you want to rescue her. That's not marriage, Mr. Bellamy. That's a fantasy born from guilt and privilege." "Maybe you're right," Gary admitted, taking a step closer but maintaining respectful distance, aware that trust was something to be earned rather than assumed. "Maybe this is crazy beyond reason, but I've spent my entire life making calculated decisions, weighing risks and benefits with mathematical precision, choosing options that made sense on paper and in boardrooms. And every single one of those smart choices led me to the emptiest existence imaginable." Tamia studied his face in the dim streetlight, her instincts warring with something she couldn't name, couldn't categorize according to her usual survival protocols. She had learned to recognize lies with the same accuracy others identified colors. They were as common in her world as hunger and cold, as predictable as sunrise. But Gary's words carried weight that felt different from the hollow promises she had heard before, heavy with truth that surprised them both. "Why would a man like you want a girl like me?" The question came out softer than she intended, revealing a vulnerability she usually kept buried beneath layers of protective steel. "You could have anyone, models, actresses, society princesses, who would fit perfectly into whatever world you come from. Women who understand your language of success and status." Gary laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter recognition of his own failures, his own journey through relationships that had looked perfect on paper, but felt empty as abandoned buildings. "You think I haven't tried that? You think I haven't dated women whose beauty could stop traffic and whose conversation could cure insomnia? Perfect women who said exactly what they thought I wanted to hear, who molded themselves into whatever shape they believed would keep my attention and my wallet open." He ran his hand through his hair, messing the perfectly styled arrangement for the first time in memory, the gesture carrying more authenticity than any professional photograph had ever captured. "Those women saw my bank account first, my potential as a status symbol second, and maybe, if I was extraordinarily lucky, something resembling the actual me running a distant third behind profit projections. Tamia listened without interrupting, recognizing truth when she heard it spoken with such raw honesty. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, everyone seemed to struggle with being seen for who they really were, rather than what others wanted them to be, what others could extract or gain from their presence. "But you," Gary continued, his voice gaining strength with each word, "you looked at me like I was just another person, not a target, not an opportunity, not a means to an end or a problem to be solved. Just a man wandering the streets at 3 a.m, probably running from something just like you might be running from something." "I'm not running from anything," Tamia said quickly, defensive instincts flaring like struck matches, automatic and bright. "Then you're stronger than me," Gary replied without hesitation, his admission carrying no shame, only honest recognition. "Because I've been running from myself for so long, I forgot what I was running toward. I forgot there was supposed to be something worth reaching for at the end of all that motion." The honesty in his admission caught Tamia off guard like unexpected rain. In her experience, powerful people rarely admitted weakness, rarely showed anything that might be interpreted as vulnerability. They wore their strength like armor, never allowing cracks to show lest someone exploit them for personal gain. "You're offering marriage to a complete stranger," Tamia pointed out, testing the boundaries of this surreal conversation, probing for the inevitable catch that would reveal this as another cruel joke disguised as opportunity. "That's not strength, Mr. Bellamy. That's desperation with expensive clothes." "Maybe it's both," Gary said, and his willingness to admit desperation somehow made him seem stronger rather than weaker, more human rather than less. "I'm desperate to feel something real, to connect with someone who sees beyond the surface polish to whatever might be worth knowing underneath. And I'm strong enough to recognize it when I find it, even if it comes in a package I never expected, even if it challenges everything I thought I wanted." Tamia felt something shift in her chest, like ice beginning to thaw after a particularly brutal winter that had seemed endless. She had grown so accustomed to defending herself against the world's assumptions that she had almost forgotten what it felt like when someone challenged those assumptions rather than confirming them, when someone looked for strength rather than weakness. "You don't know my story," she warned him, her voice carrying weight that spoke of chapters written in pain and ink that would never fully dry. "You don't know what I've done, what's been done to me, what I've survived to get to this sidewalk. Marriage isn't just about romantic feelings or midnight revelations. It's about accepting someone completely, including the parts that might horrify you." Her words carried the weight of experience that went far beyond her apparent years. Speaking of trials that had aged her soul, even while her body remained young, Gary could see shadows moving behind her eyes, glimpses of battles fought in darkness where no one could witness her victories or defeats. She wasn't just warning him about unknown difficulties. She was offering him the chance to understand what he would be taking on if he chose to love her completely. "There are things about surviving on the streets that change you in ways comfortable people can't understand," Damia continued, her voice steady but heavy with truths she rarely shared. "Things you have to do to stay alive, compromises you make with your conscience when the choice is between survival and idealism. I've seen the worst of humanity, and sometimes I've had to become harder than I wanted to be just to make it through another day." The honesty in her admission was both warning and test. She was giving Gary the opportunity to walk away before he fully understood what loving her would require. But she was also measuring his character by how he responded to the possibility that she might be damaged in ways that would challenge his capacity for acceptance. "I've made mistakes," she said quietly, "and I've been the victim of other people's choices in ways that left scars on my soul. If you think love is about finding someone perfect, someone whose past is clean and whose struggles have been noble and whose strength has never wavered, Then you're looking at the wrong woman. Then tell me, Gary said simply. The request carrying no demand, only invitation. Tell me your story. Tell me what I'm signing up for, what battles you fought, what scars you carry. Because I promise you, whatever horrors you think you're carrying, they can't be worse than the emptiness I'm living with now. Tamia stared at him for a long moment. This strange man who had wandered into her world and turned it upside down with impossible offers and unexpected sincerity. The child in her arms stirred slightly, reminding her that her life wasn't just about her own choices anymore, that decisions had consequences that rippled beyond her own survival. If I even consider this, she said slowly, her words careful and measured like steps across unstable ground, it has to be real. Not a contract, not a business arrangement, not a charitable gesture that makes you feel better about your privileged guilt or your empty penthouse. Gary nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking, recognizing the test hidden within her conditions. This must be real, not a contract, Tamia continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, gaining power from her own clarity. If we do this, it's because we choose each other, not because you need a wife and I need shelter. It's because something genuine exists between us, not because we're both running from what we don't want to face alone. The demand hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed or burned. Challenging Gary to prove his sincerity extended beyond impulsive gestures and midnight revelations. In his world, contracts defined everything. Relationships, business deals, even family obligations were spelled out in legal terms with escape clauses and penalty fees carefully negotiated. But Tamia was asking for something his lawyers couldn't draft: authentic human connection without safety nets. Real, Gary repeated, tasting the word like he was learning a foreign language that might finally help him communicate something true. No contracts, no conditions beyond what we create together. No safety nets except what we build with each other, one honest moment at a time. Real, Tamia confirmed. And for the first time since he had approached her, she almost smiled. As they shook hands in that dark alley, neither realized they had just set in motion events that would either destroy them both or forge something unbreakable. Chapter 4. The Mansion and the Vultures. Walking into Gary's world, Tamia understood that wealth was just another kind of wilderness, and she had always been a survivor who adapted to whatever terrain life demanded her to navigate. The marble floors of Gary's mansion reflected Tamia's image back at her like mirrors designed to reveal inadequacy, showing a woman whose worn clothing and weathered shoes told stories these polished surfaces had never heard. But as she walked through the grand entrance hall, her footsteps silent against stone that cost more than most people's annual salaries, she carried herself with the same unshakable dignity she had shown on the streets, refusing to let circumstances define her worth. The staff stared with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed shock, their professional composure cracking as they processed the impossible scene before them. Word had traveled through Gary's social network with the speed of wildfire, each telling embellished with new details that made the story more scandalous with every repetition. By the time Tamia crossed the threshold of his home, half the city's elite had already heard impossible rumors about the billionaire's midnight bride, each version more incredulous than the last. "This is your home now," Gary said, as he led her through rooms that could have housed entire families, his words carrying intention rather than mere politeness. "Not temporarily, not as my guest or my charity case. This is where you belong now, for as long as you choose to stay." Tamia nodded, but her eyes continued their systematic assessment of her new environment, habits forged by necessity taking inventory of every detail. She had learned long ago that survival depended on understanding your surroundings completely: exit routes, power dynamics, potential threats, and unexpected allies. This mansion might be luxurious, but it was still territory that needed to be mapped and understood if she was going to navigate it successfully. The first attack came within hours, swift and surgical as a predator's strike. "Gary, darling, we simply must discuss this situation." The voice cut through the morning air like crystal against concrete, sharp and precise in its controlled hostility. Patricia Bellamy glided into the dining room, wearing disapproval like expensive perfume. Her gaze fixed on Tamia, with the intensity of someone evaluating a threat to everything they held sacred. Patricia had built her entire identity around protecting the family legacy her late husband had entrusted to her care. She wasn't cruel by nature. She was terrified. Terrified that everything she had sacrificed her own dreams to preserve might crumble if the wrong influences entered their world. She had given up her ambitions as a concert pianist to become the perfect society wife, had channeled all her creativity into maintaining appearances and managing expectations. In her mind, Tamia represented chaos disguised as love. "Mother," Gary said carefully, tension evident in the single word, "I'd like you to meet Tamia Cherrell." "Oh, I know exactly who she is," Patricia replied, her smile sharp enough to draw blood, each word dripping with barely contained venom. "The entire country club has been buzzing about your little charitable experiment. People are calling it everything from admirable to insane." Tamia set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, meeting Patricia's hostile stare without flinching or retreating. She had faced down threats from people who would have terrified Gary's mother, survived situations where backing down meant death or worse. One disapproving matriarch, no matter how well-dressed or well-connected, wasn't going to break her spirit or shake her resolve. "Mrs. Bellamy," Tamia said, her voice carrying warm honey over steel, every syllable perfectly controlled. "What a pleasure to meet the woman who raised such a generous and courageous son." The compliment that wasn't quite a compliment hit its target perfectly, finding the weak point in Patricia's armor of social superiority. The perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment, enough to let Tamia know she was dealing with someone who understood subtle warfare but wasn't prepared for it to be waged with such grace. The social massacre truly began that afternoon when Gary's business associates arrived for what they claimed was an impromptu meeting but felt orchestrated as a coordinated assault. They didn't attack Tamia directly. That would have been too crude for their refined sensibilities, too honest for people who preferred their cruelty wrapped in silk. Instead, they wielded exclusion like a weapon, discussing charity galas she obviously couldn't attend, referencing social connections she clearly didn't possess, dropping names of schools she had never had the privilege to consider. Of course, you wouldn't understand the complexities of managing generational wealth, Rebecca Henderson said with false sympathy that dripped like poison from perfectly glossed lips, her daughter having been Gary's most recent suitable dating option according to family preferences. "It takes a particular kind of upbringing to handle these responsibilities properly." Rebecca's cruelty stemmed from her own insecurities about her family's relatively recent wealth. Her grandfather had been a factory worker, and she had spent her entire adult life trying to erase that history through perfect manners and strategic marriages. Tamia's presence reminded her uncomfortably of the arbitrary nature of social position, the thin line between having and having not that she worked desperately to forget. "You're absolutely right," Tamia replied calmly, her smile never wavering despite the calculated insult, her composure unshakable as mountain stone. "I was raised by streets that would consume most people alive without leaving bones behind. It's given me a very particular perspective on what actually matters when everything else is stripped away." The response was so unexpected, so gracefully delivered, that several of Gary's associates actually smiled despite themselves, recognizing strength when they saw it displayed so elegantly. Here was a woman who refused to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control, who turned attempted humiliation into a demonstration of power that left her attackers looking petty and small. But not everyone appreciated her resilience. Her refusal to play the victim they expected her to become. The media discovered the story within days, and the coverage was brutal with the efficiency of modern character assassination. Billionaire's homeless bride dominated headlines, accompanied by photos that had clearly been taken without permission or context. Each image designed to emphasize the contrast between Gary's wealth and Tamia's humble appearance. Social media exploded with commentary ranging from disbelief to outright cruelty. Millions of strangers feeling entitled to judge a relationship they couldn't begin to understand. She's obviously a gold digger with exceptional acting skills. One talk show host declared with the authority of someone who had never missed a meal or wondered where they would sleep. No one goes from homeless to billionaire's wife without a carefully calculated agenda. This is what happens when wealthy men have midlife crises, another added with smug certainty, reducing Gary's choice to psychological weakness rather than recognizing the courage it had taken. He'll wake up from this fantasy soon enough, and then what? The attacks weren't just about her poverty. They dissected her appearance with surgical precision, questioned her motives with assumptions that revealed more about their makers than their target, speculated about her past with the cruelty of people who had never faced real hardship themselves. Tamia watched it all unfold with the same steady composure she had shown Patricia, reading every article, watching every segment, absorbing every criticism without letting it poison the strength that had carried her this far. She had survived worse than public opinion, had endured attacks that made these seem like gentle rain compared to the storms she had weathered. The cruelest commentary came from people who had never missed a meal, never wondered where they would sleep, never faced the choice between dignity and survival. They analyzed her every gesture for signs of deception, interpreted her grace under pressure as evidence of manipulation rather than strength. The social media became a feeding frenzy of judgment from strangers who felt entitled to dissect her life because her story had become public entertainment. But perhaps the most insidious attacks came from those who tried to diminish her strength by reframing it as performance. "She's too composed," one commentator noted with suspicion. "Real homeless people don't carry themselves like that. She's playing a role." They couldn't comprehend that dignity was something she had fought to maintain, rather than something she was performing for their benefit. The psychological warfare was subtle but constant. Photographers catching her at unflattering angles, reporters asking loaded questions designed to make her stumble, social events where she was invited specifically to be excluded. Each situation was designed to break her composure, to force her into the role of victim or gold digger that would confirm their assumptions about who she must be. "They want me to break," she told Gary one evening as they sat in his library, surrounded by books that represented knowledge she had never had the chance to acquire formally. "They expect me to crumble under the pressure, to prove I don't belong here, to run back to whatever hole they think I crawled out of." The campaign against her had become systematic, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. Invitations to events were extended only to be rescinded at the last moment, leaving her dressed and ready with nowhere to go. Photographers waited outside every establishment she entered, capturing images that were then used to question her right to occupy spaces previously reserved for others. Even simple errands became exercises in enduring scrutiny designed to break her composure. "And what do you want?" Gary asked, though he already knew the answer by the fire in her eyes. "I want to show them what strength looks like when it's not inherited or purchased," Tamia replied, her voice carrying determination that could have moved mountains. "I want to prove that dignity isn't dependent on bank accounts or social approval. That character is something you earn through choices that cost you everything but give you yourself." The attacks had revealed something important about her adversaries. Their cruelty was born from fear rather than strength, their need to diminish her arising from their own insecurity about the foundations of their privilege. They attacked her because her very existence challenged the comfortable fiction that wealth equated to worth. that circumstances determined character. Gary watched her face as she spoke, seeing the steel beneath the grace, understanding that he hadn't rescued anyone. He had found someone who could stand beside him as an equal, someone whose strength complemented rather than competed with his own. That night, as Tamia sat in the vast mansion that still felt foreign but no longer felt temporary, she whispered to herself words that carried the weight of promise and threat combined. I survived the streets, the cold and the hunger, but can I survive being loved? And what will that love cost both of us? Chapter 5. The Walls Come Down. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, two broken souls began to recognize each other through the shadows of their separate pain. Finding that healing sometimes begins with honest wounds, the mansion took on different qualities in darkness, its grandeur softened by shadows that made the spaces feel more intimate, more human. It was during these quiet hours that Gary and Tamia found themselves gravitating toward each other, drawn together by an understanding that daylight somehow made more difficult to acknowledge. The formal dining rooms and pristine sitting areas gave way to the smaller spaces. The kitchen, where Tamia would make tea with hands that still remembered rationing every precious resource. The library, where Gary would find her reading with the hunger of someone discovering treasure. Their conversations began tentatively, two people circling each other like careful dancers learning a new rhythm. Gary had spent so many years having his words analyzed for market implications and strategic meaning that simple honesty felt foreign on his tongue. Tamia had learned that sharing too much could be dangerous, that vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford in a world that punished weakness without mercy. But something about the darkness made truth easier, made the walls they had built around themselves feel less necessary. "Tell me about the cold," Gary said one night as they sat in his study, the request coming from genuine curiosity rather than morbid fascination. He had seen her unconscious habits, the way she hoarded small luxuries like extra blankets, how she never left food unfinished, the way her eyes automatically mapped exit routes, even in the safety of his home. Tamia was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words for mockery or pity and finding neither. "The cold isn't just temperature," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "It's the way it seeps into your bones until you forget what warmth feels like. It's lying on concrete that steals your body heat, wearing every piece of clothing you own, and still shivering until your muscles cramp. But the worst cold isn't physical. It's the way people look through you like you're already dead. Like you don't deserve the same basic acknowledgement they give to strangers who happen to have better circumstances." Gary listened with attention that felt different from the polite interest he usually showed during business presentations. This was focused, genuine engagement with her experience rather than calculation of how her words might benefit him. "How did you survive it? Not just the physical cold, but the invisibility?" "You learned that survival isn't about what happens to you," Tamia replied, her fingers tracing patterns on the leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars. "It's about what you refuse to let those circumstances do to who you are inside. Every morning when I woke up still alive, still myself, was a victory over a world that wanted me to disappear or become something smaller, something more convenient for everyone else." The stories came in pieces over countless nights, fragments of a life that had tested her in ways Gary was only beginning to understand. She told him about the hunger that wasn't just about missing meals, but about the way it hollowed you out, made every decision revolve around the most basic needs. She described the storms that turned doorways into temporary shelters, the rain that soaked through every layer until hypothermia became a real threat, the snow that made every breath a conscious effort. But more than the physical hardships, she shared the emotional battles that had been even harder to survive. "There were nights when giving up would have been easier," she admitted, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was revealing. "When the world felt so indifferent to whether I lived or died that it seemed pointless to keep fighting." "What stopped you?" Gary asked. Though part of him already knew the answer, it was written in every gesture she made. Every decision that prioritized dignity over convenience. Stubbornness? Maybe. Tamia smiled slightly, but her eyes held depths that spoke of more complex motivations. Or maybe the understanding that my life belonged to me, not to circumstances or other people's expectations. That even if no one else could see my worth, I could still choose to see it in myself. Gary found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, admissions that would have horrified his therapist and shocked his family. He described the suffocating weight of expectations that had pressed down on him since childhood. The way every achievement felt hollow because it was measured against standards set by others rather than joy found in accomplishment itself. Success became a prison, he told her, his voice carrying surprise at his own honesty. Every victory just raised the bar higher, created new expectations I had to meet. I started making decisions based on what would look good in business magazines, rather than what felt right in my chest. The confession opened floodgates he hadn't realized existed. Gary found himself describing the crushing loneliness that came with being surrounded by people who wanted something from him, the way every conversation felt like a negotiation, even with those closest to him. He talked about board meetings where his humanity was treated as weakness, family gatherings where love was measured in stock prices and quarterly reports. "I stopped trusting my own instincts years ago," Gary admitted, his voice raw with recognition of how completely he had lost himself. Every decision got filtered through committees and consultants and market research until I couldn't tell the difference between what I wanted and what would be most profitable. I became a stranger to myself, successful but completely lost. Tamia listened without judgment, recognizing the different ways people could be broken by circumstances beyond their control. Wealth had been Gary's prison, just as poverty had been her testing ground, each presenting unique challenges that required different kinds of strength to survive. "The worst part was that everyone expected me to be grateful," Gary continued, his words flowing with the relief of finally having someone who could understand without requiring explanation. "I had everything people dream of having, so any unhappiness was treated as selfishness or weakness. I learned to hide my emptiness behind success, to perform contentment so convincingly that I almost believed it myself." Tamia understood in ways his expensive therapists never had. She recognized the different types of cages people could find themselves trapped within, understood that wealth could be as isolating as poverty when it became the only thing people saw when they looked at you. "At least your cage was comfortable," she observed without bitterness, stating fact rather than accusation. "Comfortable, but just as real," Gary replied, appreciating that she didn't diminish his struggle, even though her own had been so much more brutal. "I was dying by degrees in marble and silk instead of concrete and cold, but still dying all the same." Their late-night conversations became a ritual, a space where they could shed the performances their days required and simply exist as themselves. Gary discovered that Tamia possessed intelligence that formal education had never had the chance to polish, but that life had sharpened to remarkable effectiveness. Her insights about human nature, her understanding of what truly mattered when everything superficial was stripped away, challenged his assumptions about success and worth in ways that his Harvard MBA never had. Tamia, meanwhile, began to see past Gary's wealth to the man who had been lost beneath it. She recognized someone who, like her, had been fighting for authentic existence in a world that preferred convenient categories. His privilege hadn't protected him from loneliness or emptiness. It had simply dressed those struggles in more expensive clothing. "We're both refugees," she said one night, the observation carrying weight that surprised them both. "You from expectations that suffocated who you really are, me from circumstances that tried to erase me entirely. We found each other in the space between who we were supposed to be and who we actually are." Gary reached for her hand across the small table where their tea had grown cold while they talked. And for the first time since childhood, touch felt like connection rather than transaction. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words emerging without calculation or strategy, honest as sunrise. "I know," Tamia replied, her fingers intertwining with his in acknowledgement that felt like promise. "I'm falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me more than the streets ever did." "Why?" Gary asked, though part of him understood her fear. "Love made you vulnerable in ways that survival skills couldn't protect against." "Because survival, I understand," Tamia said, her voice carrying both strength and fragility. "But being loved, truly loved for who I am rather than what I might become, that's uncharted territory. That requires a different kind of courage." As they sat together in the quiet darkness, both understood they were crossing into something that would change them both irrevocably. Something that demanded they become braver than they had ever imagined possible. But as Gary and Tamia grew closer, neither knew that her past was about to explode into their present, and the truth would test everything they were building together. Chapter 6. The truth that shattered assumptions. The most powerful people are often those who have lost everything and chosen to rebuild rather than retreat. And Tamia Sherrill was about to reveal the full extent of her strength. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening in November, as autumn surrendered to winter's advance and the mansion's heating system hummed against the growing cold. Gary found Tamia in the conservatory, surrounded by plants that thrived in artificial warmth while the world outside prepared for dormancy. She had been quieter than usual, carrying herself with the weight of someone preparing to share something that would change everything. "There's something you need to know about me," Tamia said without preamble, her voice steady but carrying undertones that made Gary set down his book and give her his complete attention. "Something that changes the story you think you know." Gary moved closer, settling beside her on the bench facing the garden that winter was claiming inch by inch. He had learned to read her moods, to recognize when she was gathering courage for something that would cost her to share. "Tell me." Tamia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on her jeans, while she assembled words for truths she had kept buried for years. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of confession and the power of someone who had finally decided that hiding was more exhausting than honesty. "I wasn't born poor, Gary. I didn't grow up on streets or in shelters. I came from money. Not your kind of money, but enough that I never worried about meals or shelter or education." Her words fell into the space between them, like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything they thought they understood about each other. The confession tasted like copper in her mouth, metallic with the flavor of shame she had thought she'd overcome. Not shame about being poor, she had never been ashamed of that, but shame about the privileged world she had once inhabited without questioning. The assumptions she had made before life taught her what really mattered. Gary felt his assumptions reorganizing themselves, puzzle pieces clicking into new configurations that revealed a picture he hadn't expected. The intelligence he had recognized in her, the way she carried herself with innate dignity, the cultural references she sometimes made without thinking. Suddenly they made different sense. "My family wasn't just wealthy," Tamia continued, her voice growing stronger as she moved deeper into territory she had avoided for so long. "We were respected. Old money, established social position, the kind of generational wealth that comes with expectations about who you marry, how you behave, what choices are acceptable for someone with our family name." She stood and walked to the glass wall, her reflection ghost-like against the darkening garden. "I was supposed to marry someone approved by the family board of directors, masquerading as parents. Someone who would merge our holdings advantageously. Someone whose bloodline had been vetted for genetic and financial compatibility. Love was supposed to be a happy accident that occurred within approved parameters." Gary remained silent, understanding instinctively that this story needed to be told without interruption, that each word was costing her something precious. "But I fell in love with someone they considered unsuitable," Tamia said, her voice carrying old pain that had been transformed into wisdom rather than bitterness. "Someone whose only crime was being born into the wrong economic class, whose greatest failing was making me laugh and see the world as larger than quarterly profit reports." The conservatory felt too small for the emotions filling it, the carefully controlled environment unable to contain the storm of memory and revelation breaking between them. "I chose him," Tamia said simply, but the words carried the weight of a decision that had cost her everything she had known. "I chose love over comfort, authenticity over approval, my heart over their plans. I thought love would be enough, that choosing each other meant we could build something real together." Gary felt something cold forming in his stomach, recognition of where this story was heading even before she confirmed his fears. "He left," Tamia continued, her voice remaining steady, though Gary could see the cost of these words in the tension of her shoulders. "When the pressure came, when my family made it clear that loving me meant a lifetime of being excluded from their world, when he realized that being with me meant giving up the comfortable life he had imagined, he chose the easier path." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of abandonment and betrayal that had shaped everything that came after. "My family expected me to crawl back," Tamia said, turning from the window to face Gary directly. "They were certain that being abandoned would cure me of my romantic notions, that losing him would make me grateful for their forgiveness and ready to accept their version of my future. But you didn't," Gary said, understanding now why her strength felt so absolute, so unshakable. "I couldn't," Tamia replied, and for the first time since she had begun this story, she almost smiled. Going back would have meant admitting that their version of love, calculated, conditional, based on mutual benefit rather than genuine connection, was the only kind that mattered. It would have meant accepting that my judgment was worthless, that my heart couldn't be trusted. That authentic emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford. Gary began to understand the full scope of what she had sacrificed, the courage it had taken to choose dignity over comfort, integrity over security. "So I left," Tamia said, her voice carrying pride alongside pain. "I walked away from trust funds and inheritances, from family connections and social position, from everything I had ever known. I chose to be homeless rather than soulless, to risk poverty rather than accept spiritual bankruptcy." The magnitude of her choice hit Gary like a physical blow. She hadn't just survived homelessness, she had chosen it rather than compromise her principles, had voluntarily entered a world of struggle and hardship because she refused to let others define the terms of her existence. "The first night was the hardest," Tamia continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory that had been buried but never forgotten. "I sat in a park with nothing but the clothes I wore and the chain around my neck, watching families go home to warm dinners while I wondered what I had done. My phone kept ringing, my mother, my siblings, even some of my father's business associates who thought they could convince me to come to my senses." Gary could picture her in that moment, young and terrified but unbreakable, choosing the unknown over the unacceptable. "They offered me everything," Tamia said, her eyes distant, with the pain of choices that had cost her more than anyone should have to pay. A trust fund larger than what I'd walked away from, an arranged marriage to someone more suitable, even the promise that they would accept my original choice if I would just come home and discuss it rationally. But I understood what they really meant, that love was negotiable, that principles were luxuries I couldn't afford, that being true to myself was less important than being comfortable. The silence stretched between them, filled with the enormity of sacrifice that few people could comprehend, let alone make. "I learned things about myself in those 5 years that I never would have discovered in comfort," Tamia said, her voice growing stronger. I learned that I could survive anything except betraying who I really was. I learned that dignity isn't inherited. It's earned through choices that cost you everything, but give you yourself. How long? Gary asked, his voice rough with emotion he was still processing. 5 years, Tamia replied. 5 years of learning what I was really made of. 5 years of discovering that dignity doesn't depend on bank accounts or family approval. 5 years of finding out what strength looks like when it's tested by everything life can throw at it. The number hung between them like a bridge across an ocean of experience Gary could barely imagine. 5 years of winters without adequate heating. 5 years of hunger that went beyond missing meals. 5 years of being invisible to a world that preferred not to acknowledge her existence. But also 5 years of discovering inner resources she might never have found in comfort. 5 years of learning that survival was as much about maintaining humanity as sustaining physical life. There were moments when I questioned everything, Tamia admitted, her voice carrying the weight of complete honesty. Nights when I wondered if pride was worth dying for, if stubbornness was just another word for stupidity. But every time I considered going back, I realized I had become someone I couldn't abandon, someone who chose authenticity over ease, someone who proved that circumstances don't determine character. Gary stared at her, seeing her completely for the first time. This wasn't a woman who had been defeated by circumstances. This was someone who had faced the ultimate test of character and emerged victorious. She had proven that her values weren't just comfortable philosophies, but principles worth sacrificing everything to maintain. The magnitude of her choice expanded in his understanding, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. She hadn't just chosen poverty over compromise. She had chosen to discover who she really was when every artificial support was stripped away, when only the essential self remained. "You chose the streets," he said, awe evident in his voice, "rather than surrender who you really are." "I chose authenticity," Tamia corrected, her voice carrying power that filled the conservatory. "I chose to find out who I really was when everything artificial was stripped away. And I learned that I'm strong enough to survive anything except becoming someone I couldn't." Respect. The weight of her choice continued to unfold in Gary's understanding like layers of meaning in a complex piece of art. She hadn't just walked away from money. She had walked away from the entire system that defined worth, through accumulation rather than character. In doing so, she had proven that identity wasn't something inherited, but something forged through choices that revealed the true nature of the person making them. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort. Tamia continued, her voice carrying the reflection of someone who had had years to process her experience. It wasn't the hunger or the cold or even the danger. It was learning to see myself as worthy of love and respect when the entire world seemed determined to prove otherwise. When you're homeless, people look through you like you're already dead, like your humanity is somehow diminished by your circumstances. Gary felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of strength and survival. He had always equated security with safety, wealth with protection, but Tamia had discovered something more powerful. Self-respect that couldn't be taken away by external circumstances. Dignity that existed independent of others' recognition or validation. But I also learned things about human kindness that I never would have discovered in comfort, Tamia said, her expression softening with memory. There's a solidarity among people who have nothing that the wealthy can't understand. Strangers sharing their last meal, offering shelter when they barely have enough for themselves, protecting each other not because of what they might gain, but simply because it's right. The revelations kept coming, each one adding depth to Gary's understanding of the woman he had chosen to love. She hadn't just survived the streets. She had been educated by them in ways that no university could replicate, learning about human nature and social dynamics from a perspective most people never gained access to. As Tamia finished her story, Gary's phone buzzed against the glass table beside him. The message that appeared made his blood run cold, the words striking like ice against the warmth of revelation they had been sharing. "We know who she really is, and tomorrow everyone else will too." Chapter 7, The Stand That Defined Them. When the world tries to destroy you, the only choice is to stand taller than you ever thought possible. And Tamia Sherrill was about to show everyone what unbreakable really meant. The attack came with the precision of a military operation, coordinated and devastating in its scope. Gary's phone rang at dawn, his publicist's voice tight with panic as she delivered news that would have sent most people into hiding. They found her family records, Gary. Her real name, her background, the inheritance she walked away from. It's everywhere. Television, internet, newspapers. They're calling her everything from a trust fund fraud to a master manipulator. Tamia stood in the kitchen, making coffee with hands that remained perfectly steady, despite the chaos erupting around them. She had been expecting this moment since the night she shared her truth with Gary, understanding that secrets in their world had shorter lifespans than flowers. The only question had been timing and scope, and the answer was arriving with the brutality she had anticipated. Gary's family had orchestrated this revelation with surgical precision, presenting Tamia's past as evidence of deception rather than courage. They painted her homelessness as performance art, her struggles as calculated manipulation designed to win Gary's sympathy and access to his fortune. Every choice she had made was reframed as strategy, every sacrifice reinterpreted as investment in a long-term con game. Tamia Wells, the morning news anchor, announced, with the false gravity television, reserved for scandals involving the wealthy. Real name, Tamia Alexandria Wells Sherrill, heiress to the Wells textile fortune, abandoned her family's wealth 5 years ago in what sources describe as an elaborate scheme to position herself for an even greater fortune through strategic marriage. The footage that followed had clearly been provided by her family, photographs from charity galas and society events, images of a younger Tamia in designer gowns, standing beside people who had written her off as dead when she chose love over their approval. The contrast between those images and recent paparazzi shots was devastating, each comparison designed to support the narrative of calculated deception. Gary watched Tamia's face as the reports played on every channel, searching for signs of the shame or panic his family expected to see. Instead, he found something that made his chest swell with pride: absolute calm, the unshakable composure of someone who had nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. The media circus had reached fever pitch, with each outlet trying to outdo the others in their coverage of what they had dubbed the homeless heiress scandal. Talk shows dedicated entire segments to analyzing her every gesture, bringing in body language experts to interpret her composure as evidence of either masterful deception or genuine strength. The narrative had become a Rorschach test for viewers' own beliefs about class, worth, and the American dream. What struck Gary most profoundly was how the coverage revealed more about the commentators than about Tamia herself. Those who had never faced real adversity saw manipulation in her strength, while those who understood struggle recognized authenticity in her refusal to be diminished. The divide was stark and telling, comfort breeding suspicion, while experience recognized truth. Social media had become a battlefield where strangers fought over a story they understood only through carefully edited headlines. Hashtags emerged on both sides, homeless heiress trending alongside Chew Authentic Love, each representing fundamentally different worldviews about what made relationships genuine and what made people worthy of love. The most insidious aspect of the coverage was how it tried to erase her 5 years of struggle by reframing them as performance art. She always had a safety net. One particularly cruel commentator noted, knowing She could return to wealth whenever the experiment got too difficult. They couldn't comprehend that burning bridges completely required more courage than maintaining escape routes, that her choice to cut ties with her family had made her homelessness as real as anyone else's. "They expect me to run," Tamia said, her voice carrying certainty rather than fear. "They think this exposure will send me scurrying back to whatever hole they believe I crawled out of. They're waiting for me to prove their assumptions about my character." "What are you going to do?" Gary asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer by the steel in her spine, the set of her shoulders that spoke of battles about to be fought and won. "I'm going to show them what real strength looks like," Tamia replied, her voice carrying promise and threat in equal measure. "They want a performance? They're about to get the most authentic one they've ever witnessed." The press conference was scheduled for noon, hastily arranged by Gary's publicity team, who assumed damage control meant separation and distancing. They had prepared statements about temporary relationships and misunderstandings, scripts designed to minimize Gary's association with what they saw as a public relations disaster. Instead, they found themselves coordinating something unprecedented, a joint appearance where both Gary and Tamia would address the media together, presenting a united front against attacks that had been designed to divide them. Tamia chose her outfit with the same strategic precision a general might plan a decisive battle. Not the designer clothes Gary could have provided, not an attempt to reclaim the wealthy image her family was using against her, but a simple black dress that emphasized her dignity while acknowledging her current reality. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had chosen authenticity over comfort and was prepared to defend that choice against any attack. The media gathered like vultures scenting carrion, cameras and microphones creating a forest of mechanical attention focused on what they assumed would be either confession or capitulation. The questions came like arrows, sharp and designed to wound. "Ms. Wells, did you deceive Mr. Bellamy about your background? Was your homelessness a calculated strategy to gain his sympathy? How do you respond to your family's accusations of manipulation?" Tamia stood at the podium with the presence of someone who had faced far worse than hostile questions from comfortable people. When she spoke, her voice carried across the room like music, clear and strong and absolutely unashamed. "My name is Tamia Sherrill," she began, claiming the identity she had chosen rather than the one she had inherited. "5 years ago, I made a decision that shocked my family and apparently continues to shock many of you. I chose love over money, authenticity over approval, and integrity over comfort." The room fell silent, reporters recognizing something in her tone that suggested this wasn't going to follow their expected script. "I didn't deceive anyone about my background because my background is not my identity," Tamia continued, her words carrying power that made cameras focus and notebooks still. "Who I used to be matters less than who I chose to become when everything was taken away. I'm not defined by the money I walked away from, but by the strength I found when I had nothing left but my principles." She paused, scanning the room with eyes that held no shame, no apology for choices that had cost her everything and given her more than she could have imagined. "I will never hide again," Tamia declared, each word ringing like a bell in the sudden silence. "Not from my past, not from your judgment, not from the consequences of choosing authenticity in a world that prefers comfortable lies. I survived 5 years on streets that would terrify most of you, not because I was planning some elaborate deception, but because I refused to compromise my soul for comfort." The declaration hung in the air like thrown gauntlet, challenging everyone present to match her courage or acknowledge their own lack of it. Gary stepped forward then, his movement deliberate and unmistakable. He took Tamia's hand in full view of every camera, every recording device, every journalist who had come to witness what they assumed would be her destruction. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled media, cameras flashing with renewed intensity as they captured the moment that would define how this story was remembered. This wasn't damage control or strategic positioning. This was a man publicly choosing the woman he loved over every other consideration, making a statement that no public relations team would have recommended. "This is my wife," Gary said, his voice carrying across the room with absolute certainty that silenced even the most aggressive reporters, "and I have never been prouder of anyone in my entire life." The statement was bold enough to shift the entire narrative, transforming what should have been Tamia's moment of exposure into Gary's declaration of commitment. But the power of the moment went deeper than words. It was visible in the way he stood beside her, not as protector but as equal, not as rescuer but as partner who had chosen to link his fate to hers, regardless of public opinion. The crowd of reporters began to shift their focus, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of covering the wealthy and powerful. Instead of the typical pattern of rich men distancing themselves from controversy, they were seeing someone who moved closer to it, who claimed it as his own choice rather than running from association with it. Some of the journalists began to reframe their questions, no longer attacking Tamia's motives, but trying to understand Gary's decision. "Mr. Bellamy, are you concerned about the impact this will have on your business interests?" One called out, but Gary's response was immediate and unwavering. "My business interests are secondary to my personal commitments," he replied, his words carrying the weight of decision made without reservation. "Success that requires me to abandon the people I love isn't success worth having." Instead of the shame and retreat everyone expected, Tamia squeezed Gary's hand and smiled, not the brittle expression of someone putting on a brave face, but the genuine warmth of someone who had found exactly what she had been searching for without knowing she was looking. As they faced the cameras together, standing hand in hand against the storm of scrutiny and judgment, neither knew that the biggest revelation was yet to come, one that would change everything they thought they knew about their marriage and the forces that had brought them together. Chapter C. Boo, the test that revealed the truth. Sometimes the greatest lies are told to reveal the greatest truths, and Gary Bellamy was about to discover that his grandfather's final gift was the freedom to choose authentically. The lawyer arrived exactly 1 week after the media storm, his appearance as precisely timed as everything else about this revelation that would reshape Gary's understanding of his entire life. Jonathan Myers had been the Bellamy family attorney for 3 decades, a man whose reputation for discretion was matched only by his talent for dramatic timing when situations required revelation rather than concealment. Gary and Tamia sat together in the mansion's library, surrounded by books that represented knowledge neither of them had needed for the education they had received in the streets and boardrooms of real experience. Their hands were intertwined, fingers locked together with the strength of people who had weathered storms and emerged more connected rather than broken apart. "Mr. Bellamy, Mrs. Bellamy," Jonathan began, his formal address of Tamia carrying recognition that legal documents didn't always reflect social reality. "I'm here regarding your grandfather's estate and certain provisions that have now become relevant to your circumstances." Gary felt tension coiling in his chest, like a spring wound too tightly. His grandfather had been a man of elaborate schemes and complex motivations, someone who believed that the most important lessons could only be learned through experience rather than explanation. Even in death, his influence continued to shape Gary's life in ways that were only now becoming clear. "There's something you need to understand about the inheritance conditions you believed governed your marriage requirements," Jonathan continued, opening a briefcase that contained documents bearing the weight of truth long concealed. "The requirement that you marry before your 35th birthday to maintain control of the family trust. It was never real. The words landed in the quiet room like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that would continue expanding long after the initial impact. Gary stared at the lawyer, his mind struggling to process information that challenged everything he had believed about the forces shaping his life. "I don't understand," Gary said, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose fundamental assumptions were being systematically dismantled. Jonathan smiled with the expression of someone about to deliver news that would change everything in ways both wonderful and terrifying. "Your grandfather created that condition as a test. Mr. Bellamy, he was deeply concerned that the pressures of wealth and social expectation would prevent you from ever discovering what real love looked like, would trap you in relationships based on mutual benefit rather than authentic connection." Tamia listened, with the focused attention of someone whose survival had depended on understanding the motivations of powerful people, recognizing the complexity of what they were hearing even before its full implications became clear. "Your grandfather was a student of human nature," Jonathan explained, settling back in his chair as if preparing to tell a story that had been waiting years for the right audience. "He watched your father marry for status, your uncle choose wives like business acquisitions, your cousins treat relationships as networking opportunities. He saw a family pattern that horrified him, love reduced to spreadsheet calculations and compatibility assessments." Gary suddenly remembered other moments. His grandfather's searching questions about happiness, the way he had studied Gary's face during family gatherings, his cryptic comments about authentic connection that had seemed like philosophical rambling at the time. He was testing all of us, wasn't he? Watching to see who might break the pattern. Gary felt pieces of his life rearranging themselves like a puzzle being solved by invisible hands, showing him a picture he had never imagined existed. He spent the last 5 years of his life designing this test, Jonathan continued, his voice carrying admiration for a complex mind that had worked beyond its own death to guide someone it loved. He studied psychology, consulted relationship experts, even hired private investigators to understand how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. He wanted to create circumstances that would force you to choose authentically. The elaborateness of the deception was staggering in its scope and touching in its motivation. He believed that given complete freedom, people often make safe choices that protect them from vulnerability, Jonathan said. But given the right pressure, the right urgency, they reveal who they really are beneath all the protective mechanisms. He invented the marriage requirement, Jonathan continued, his words carrying the weight of revelation long prepared but carefully timed, to create urgency that would force you to make decisions based on instinct rather than calculation, to choose from your heart rather than your head or your family's expectations. Gary felt the world tilting around him like a ship in heavy seas, everything he thought he knew about his choices shifting into new configurations. "You're telling me that my decision to marry Tamia wasn't influenced by inheritance pressure because there was no inheritance pressure?" "Precisely," Jonathan confirmed, his smile growing wider as he witnessed understanding dawn. "Every choice you made regarding your relationship with Mrs. Bellamy was authentic, uninfluenced by financial considerations or family obligations. You chose each other freely, which was exactly what your grandfather hoped would happen when the artificial constraints were removed." The silence in the library felt profound, heavy with the weight of truth that was both liberating and overwhelming. Gary had spent months believing he was defying family expectations and financial pressure to be with Tamia, when in reality, he had been following his grandfather's deeper plan to help him discover authentic love. Tamia was the first to speak, her voice carrying curiosity rather than accusation. Did he know who Gary would choose? Jonathan shook his head, his expression thoughtful. He couldn't predict the specific person, but he understood Gary well enough to know that when freed from artificial constraints, he would recognize genuine connection when he found it. He believed that real love would be unmistakable if Gary was forced to choose without the safety net of approved options. Gary stood and walked to the window, looking out at gardens that suddenly seemed different, transformed by the understanding that his choices had been more authentic than he had realized. So everything I thought I was rebelling against was carefully constructed to ensure your rebellion would lead you toward authenticity rather than away from it, Jonathan finished. Your grandfather was a complex man who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to discover who they really are when artificial supports are removed. The revelation reframed everything, not just their marriage, but Gary's entire understanding of his relationship with his family's expectations. He had thought he was choosing love over duty, when in reality he had been fulfilling the deepest duty his grandfather could have imagined, the obligation to live authentically. Everyone expected me to be furious about being manipulated, Gary said, turning back to face Jonathan and Tamia, his voice carrying wonder rather than anger. They thought I would feel betrayed by the deception. But instead of betrayal, Gary felt something like gratitude blooming in his chest. His grandfather's elaborate scheme had given him the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to discover that his capacity for authentic love existed, that beneath all the conditioning and expectations lived someone capable of choosing with his heart rather than his head. The test had revealed something profound about both of them. Gary had proven he could recognize genuine worth when it appeared in unexpected forms, while Tamia had demonstrated that her strength wasn't dependent on circumstances, but was an intrinsic part of who she was, regardless of external conditions. It's beautiful. In a way, Tamia observed, her voice carrying appreciation for the complexity of love that transcended death. He loved you enough to trust that given the right circumstances, you would choose well. He believed in who you could become even when you didn't believe in it yourself. And how do you feel? Tamia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer by the expression on his face. Gary looked at her, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time the miracle of what they had found together. For once in my life, I wasn't chasing fortune or following someone else's script. I was making choices based on what felt real, what mattered to me personally, rather than professionally. The smile that spread across his face was transformative, joy breaking through the controlled expressions he had worn for so many years, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I was choosing love completely and authentically. Without knowing, I was free to make that choice. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that Gary's most authentic decision had come when he believed he was being forced into it, that his truest expression of love had emerged when he thought he was fulfilling an obligation. It suggested something profound about human nature, about how genuine feeling could transcend artificial constraints and reveal itself even through the most unlikely circumstances. Your grandfather understood something about love that took me 34 years to learn, Gary said, his voice carrying wonder at the complexity of wisdom that had guided him from beyond the grave. He knew that real connection can't be manufactured or arranged, but it can be recognized when it appears, even in the most unexpected forms. The realization was both humbling and liberating. Gary had spent years believing that his grandfather's expectations were limiting his freedom, when in reality they had been designed to help him discover what freedom actually meant. True choice wasn't about having unlimited options. It was about having the courage to recognize the right option when it appeared, and the strength to choose it regardless of external pressure. "He would have loved you," Gary told Tamia, the statement carrying certainty despite the impossibility of their ever meeting. "Not because you proved his test worked, but because you represent everything he hoped I would be wise enough to recognize. Strength that doesn't depend on circumstances, authenticity that can't be purchased, love that chooses based on character rather than convenience." Jonathan gathered his papers. His mission completed with the satisfaction of someone who had delivered exactly the right news at exactly the right moment. The lawyer had been carrying this secret for months, waiting for the precise moment when its revelation would provide confirmation rather than confusion, validation rather than doubt. As the lawyer prepared to leave, he paused at the library door, his expression carrying the warmth of someone who had witnessed something beautiful unfold, according to plan. He would be proud of both of you, not just for finding each other, but for choosing each other despite every apparent obstacle. After Jonathan left, Gary and Tamia sat in the quiet library, processing the magnitude of what they had learned. The love they had found was even more authentic than they had realized, built on choices that were completely their own, rather than responses to external pressure. But as Gary reached for Tamia's hand to celebrate their freedom from obligation, he saw tears in her eyes and realized the test wasn't over. Yet, Chapter 9, The Confession. That changed everything. The strongest people are those who can be vulnerable without losing their power, and Tamia Chirel was about to show Gary the true depths of both her strength and her heart. The tears that fell down Tamia's cheeks were not born of sadness, but of something far more complex, emotions so overwhelming that her usually unshakable composure finally cracked under their weight. Gary watched her with growing concern, recognizing that these weren't tears of relief or joy, but something deeper, more fundamental to who she was becoming in this moment of complete honesty. "Tamia," Gary said softly, reaching toward her but stopping just short of touch, understanding instinctively that she needed space to find her words without the comfort of physical connection influencing what she had to say. "You don't understand," Tamia said, her voice breaking in ways Gary had never heard before, revealing vulnerability that made her seem simultaneously more fragile and more powerful than he had ever seen her. "All this time I thought you married me because you had to, because some obligation or pressure forced you to make choices your heart might not have made freely." Gary felt his chest tighten as he began to understand the direction of her revelation, the weight she had been carrying without his knowledge. "I convinced myself that I was strong enough to build something real from artificial beginnings," Tamia continued, her words coming between the tears that she wasn't trying to stop or hide. "I told myself that even if you started this marriage for the wrong reasons, I could make you stay for the right ones. That I could earn your love through strength and patience, and proving I was worth choosing freely." The admission hung between them like exposed nerve, raw and honest in ways that took Gary's breath away. He had never imagined that his strong, unshakable Tamia had been harboring such doubts, had been fighting battles he hadn't even known existed. But hearing that lawyer, understanding that every choice you made was authentic from the beginning, Tamia's voice gained strength even as tears continued to fall, her words carrying the power of truth finally set free. "It changes everything I thought I understood about us, about what this means, about why we're here together." Gary moved closer, no longer able to maintain distance when she was sharing something so fundamental to her understanding of their relationship. "Tell me what you're thinking. Help me understand what this changes for you." Tamia looked at him through tears that made her eyes shine like stars reflected in water, her expression carrying vulnerability and strength in measures that seemed impossible to balance, but that she managed with grace that left him breathless. "I never needed your mansion, Gary," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion making her words thick with feeling. "I never needed your name or your money or your social position. Those things were never why I said yes to your impossible proposal in that alley." Gary waited, understanding that she was building towards something important, something that would define who they were together moving forward. "All I ever wanted," Tamia continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was someone who truly sees me. Not what I used to have, not what I lack now, not what I might become with the right opportunities, but just me. The person I am right now, in this moment, with all my history and all my scars and all my strength earned through surviving what should have broken me. The confession was delivered with the force of prayer and the precision of oath, words that carried the weight of everything she had learned about herself through years of testing and trial. "I wanted someone who would choose me," Tamia said, her tears slowing as truth found its proper voice. "Not because I fit into their world perfectly, not because I solved some problem or filled some gap in their life, but because something about who I am resonated with something about who they are. I wanted to be chosen for me." Gary felt his heart expanding in his chest, making room for love that had just revealed new depths he hadn't known existed. Watching Tamia in this moment of complete vulnerability, he understood that he was witnessing something sacred, the complete opening of a heart that had learned to protect itself through necessary walls that were now coming down by choice. "And that's exactly what happened," Gary said, his voice carrying certainty that made Tamia's remaining tears feel like celebration rather than sorrow. "Every choice I made, every moment I chose you over comfort or convenience or family approval, all of it was authentic. All of it was my heart choosing yours before my mind could interfere with calculations or strategies." Tamia smiled through her tears, the expression transforming her face in ways that made the mansion's expensive artwork pale by comparison. "I know that now, and knowing it, really understanding that you chose me freely, it's terrifying and beautiful and more than I ever dared to hope for." "Why terrifying?" Gary asked, though he suspected he understood her fear. "Because being chosen freely means I'm truly seen," Tamia replied, her honesty continuing to flow like water from a spring that had finally found its source. "It means I can't hide behind the idea that circumstances brought us together, can't protect myself by believing that your love is conditional or temporary or based on misunderstanding about who I really am." The fear in her voice was real and raw, the terror of someone who had learned to survive by controlling what others could see of her, who had used circumstances as armor against the vulnerability that comes with being completely known. "For so long, I could tell myself that if you ever truly saw me, all my flaws, all my fears, all the ways I'm broken from everything I've survived, you would understand that you had made a mistake," Tamia continued, her words coming faster now as if speaking them quickly might make them less frightening. "I could protect myself with the belief that your love was circumstantial, that when the novelty wore off or the pressure got too intense, you would remember that you had other options, better options, easier options." Gary felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he understood the depth of fear she had been carrying, the weight of believing herself unworthy of authentic love despite every evidence of her extraordinary worth. "But if you chose me freely," Tamia whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of confession that felt like prayer, "then there's nowhere to hide. Then I have to believe that I am actually worthy of being loved completely. And that terrifies me more than the streets ever did, because I don't know how to protect myself from hope that real." The vulnerability in her admission was breathtaking, showing Gary a woman who could face down any external enemy, but was still learning to trust that she deserved the very thing she had always wanted most. Her strength hadn't made her fearless. It had made her brave enough to feel fear and keep moving forward anyway. Gary reached for her hands, holding them with touch that felt like promise and sanctuary combined. "You are truly seen, Tamia. Every part of you, your strength and your vulnerability, your past and your present, your choices and your dreams. I see all of it, and I choose all of it completely and forever." The words hung in the air between them like vows spoken in a church made of trust rather than stone, witnessed by truth rather than congregation. "I love you," Tamia whispered, the simple words carrying weight that made them feel both revolutionary and inevitable. "Not because you rescued me, not because you provided safety or comfort or opportunity, but because you see me and choose me and make me want to be brave enough to be completely myself with another person. The declaration hung in the air between them like a bridge built from courage and honesty, spanning the distance between two souls who had learned that love wasn't about completing each other, but about choosing to grow together. Tamia had never felt safer or more terrified in her life. Safe because Gary's love asked nothing of her except authenticity. Terrified because authenticity meant she could no longer hide behind the armor of self-reliance she had worn for so long. "I love you too," Gary replied, understanding that they were crossing into territory that would change them both irrevocably. "And I'm about to show you exactly what that means." As Gary rose from his chair, Tamia saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not fear, but anticipation of something that would complete the circle of choosing that had brought them together in that dark alley, what felt like lifetimes ago. Gary dropped to his knees, but not in defeat, in recognition of the most powerful woman he had ever met. And he had something to show her that would prove everything. Chapter 10, The Ring That Bound Two Souls. True love doesn't rescue. It recognizes, honors and chooses to walk alongside another soul as they become who they were always meant to be. Gary knelt before Tamia not as supplicant before royalty, but as one equal honoring another, his position chosen to demonstrate reverence rather than desperation. In his hands, he held something that made Tamia's breath catch, not a diamond that represented wealth or status, but something infinitely more meaningful that proved he had been listening to every story she had shared, understanding every truth she had revealed about what actually mattered to her. The ring he presented was crafted from gold that gleamed warm in the library's soft lighting, but it was the source of that gold that made Tamia's eyes fill with tears of recognition and wonder. Gary had taken the chain she had worn during her years on the streets, her only possession of value beyond the strength of her spirit, and had it transformed into something that honored both their journey together and her courage in surviving alone. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The jeweler had preserved the chain's original texture in places, creating a band that told the story of transformation without erasing the evidence of struggle. Tiny imperfections from years of wear had been incorporated into the design, making them features rather than flaws. It was the most beautiful thing Tamia had ever seen, not because of its monetary value, but because it represented the alchemy of turning survival into celebration. "This chain," Gary said, his voice steady despite the emotion making his chest tight with feeling, "was with you through everything. Through hunger and cold, through storms and loneliness, through every moment when giving up would have been easier than continuing. It witnessed your strength when no one else could see it." Tamia stared at the ring, recognizing the metal that had rested against her skin during the hardest years of her life, now transformed into a circle that represented everything they had chosen to build together. "You could have thrown it away when you came here," Gary continued, his words carrying understanding that went deeper than surface appreciation. "You had no reason to keep something that reminded you of pain and struggle, but you kept it because it represented survival, because it was proof that you had endured when the world expected you to surrender. I kept it because it was mine," Tamia whispered, her voice thick with emotion that made her words feel precious as the gold Gary held. "It was the one thing that belonged completely to me, that no one could take away or use against me. And now I'm asking you to let me add my promise to it," Gary said, holding the ring steady despite hands that wanted to tremble with the magnitude of what this moment meant. "Not to replace what it means to you, but to join my commitment to yours, to make it a symbol of what we've chosen together." The transformation of her chain into their ring felt like magic, like alchemy that turned survival into celebration, solitude into partnership, endurance into joy. But it was Gary's words that made the gesture complete. "You were never homeless, Tamia," Gary said, his declaration carrying the weight of truth finally given voice. My heart was the one without a home until you gave it shelter. You didn't need rescuing from anything except a world that couldn't see your worth. You rescued me from emptiness I thought was just the price of success. Tamia felt the last of her walls crumbling, not from attack, but from the gentle insistence of love that asked for nothing except the chance to honor who she already was. I was dying in luxury. Gary continued, his honesty as complete as hers had been, suffocating in comfort, drowning in privilege that felt more like punishment. You didn't save me from poverty. You saved me from spiritual bankruptcy that all my money couldn't cure. The ring caught the light as Gary held it, reflecting illumination that seemed to come from within rather than without, as if the gold remembered every moment it had spent close to Tamia's heart and was now ready to hold both their promises together. This isn't about becoming someone new, Gary said, sliding the ring onto Tamia's finger with touch that felt like coming home. It's about recognizing who we already were when we found each other, about choosing to become more ourselves together than we could ever be apart. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting her entire life to find its proper place. Tamia stared at her hand, seeing not jewelry but symbol of journey completed and new adventure beginning. Proof that the hardest things in life often led to the most beautiful destinations. We're not a billionaire and a homeless woman, Tamia said, her voice carrying certainty that made the words feel like prophecy. We're two people who were lost in different kinds of wilderness and found each other exactly when we needed to be found. Gary rose from his knees and took Tamia's hands, their fingers intertwining with familiarity that felt both new and ancient, as if they had been designed to fit together precisely this way. We're two people who chose authenticity over convenience, Gary added, understanding that their story was just beginning, that the ring represented not ending, but commencement of something that would grow stronger with every choice they made to see and choose each other completely. They embraced then, holding each other with arms that had learned to offer shelter rather than seek it, protection rather than demand it. Their love felt solid as the mansion's foundation, but infinitely more valuable, built on bedrock of truth rather than transaction. This wasn't the desperate clinging of people trying to fill empty spaces in themselves, but the conscious choosing of two complete souls who had discovered they created something larger together than either could achieve alone. As they stood together in the library, surrounded by books that told other people's stories, they understood they were writing their own tale, one that spoke of courage rewarded, authenticity recognized, and love discovered not despite their differences, but because of the way those differences created harmony rather than discord. Their story would never grace the covers of romance novels because it was too real, too hard-won, too honest about the price of choosing love over convenience. The world outside continued its judgments and assumptions, but inside their embrace, Gary and Tamia had found something that no external force could touch or diminish. They had found home in each other, not as refuge from life, but as launching point for living more fully than either had imagined possible. And as they walked hand in hand toward whatever challenges and joys waited beyond the library doors, the world finally understood the most powerful force isn't money, status, or control. It's two souls choosing each other against all odds, creating something beautiful from the honest meeting of authentic hearts.